The SciComm Collective acknowledges the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation as the traditional custodians of the lands we study, write and record on, and that their sovereignty was never ceded. Hello and welcome to the SciComm Collective.
Different useful knowledge in different areas.
The joy is sharing it.
Making science accessible.
The ignored final step of the scientific method.
Every different perspective.
Science is culture.
The SciComm Collective brings science and science communication to you. Hi everyone, Holly here. In this week's episode, I talk with Dr Heather Bray. Heather is a senior lecturer at the University of Western Australia and coordinates the science communication courses. That means most of us here at the SciComm Collective have been taught by her. So we know firsthand how much science communication experience she has and how good she is at talking about it. So we knew she'd make a fantastic guest on the podcast. I hope you enjoy our conversation about Heather's journey from the sciences to science communication to science communication. Thank you so much for sitting down with us today, Heather.
You're most welcome.
So I wanted to talk to you today about your SciComm story, how you got into it. So Heather, how did you first get started in research?
Well, I was originally in science research, of course, before I ended up in science communication research. So I guess for me, where did it start is a really hard question to answer because I think I've always been curious. Mm-hmm. And I think all children are curious. And I was really lucky in that even though I didn't come from a wealthy family, I came from a very working class family. Both of my parents didn't actually finish high school. I came from a family that valued education. And in fact, it was really my grandfather who didn't even go to high school at all. He left school at the end of primary school. He saw education as the ticket out of the working classes. And that was the sort of mantra that I grew up with. It's like the way to progress, to rise up out of the working class is to be able to access education. So we were a family that believed in self-education. We tended to be ABC watchers. I grew up in a country town in New South Wales that only had 2 television channels. So you were either a ABC watcher or a Win 4 watcher in our case. My parents they were in book clubs, and so we were getting National Geographic and, those Time Life books that I just ate as a child. I could name dinosaurs. I taught myself the Greek alphabet like normal children do by the age of 12. We had a computer and I, was, writing BASIC back then. And so I was, and because I also went to a very small primary school, we were all in the one class. And so for me, it was just all learning. And I didn't see history as any different to science. It was just finding out stuff. And so for me to end up in research is really just a continuation of that process. Mm-hmm. I get paid to find out stuff. I get paid to be curious. It is actually the best job ever. I can go, that's interesting. Why is that? And I can go and find it out. And then I get to tell people what I've found out. So for me, research is really just about curiosity. It's about finding out stuff. I initially wanted to find out stuff about archaeology. That's what I wanted to be first. And because I love that history stuff and that mixture of history and science, I guess we would call it now, but I didn't know that they were different things. And then I became interested in agriculture by accident, but it was where the science became alive for me. So I was still learning about history and doing other things, but once Indiana Jones came out, everyone was like, oh, you'll never get a job in archaeology. And I was like, oh, boo-hoo, so I'll go in to do agriculture. And that was where science became alive because it was where science was taught in a social context. We also learned about history, about economics at the same time as we were learning chemistry and biology. And you could go to the farm, you could see it, you could touch it, you could eat it. And it was just so much more alive than the science units that I was studying. And for me, that was the way to go. So I ended up sort of going all the way down into a PhD. I did actually want to study acting at one time, but my dad said get a qualification first. So I was also doing, the drama and the public speaking and all of that at the same time as learning about science. And so for me, learning about how things work was fascinating. I still am fascinated by physiology, the act of breathing, of being alive, what that is and biochemistry that just powers us bags full of water, that stuff, like thoughts, where they come from, that stuff still fascinates me. But now, obviously, my career in agriculture didn't pan out. Now it's these fascinating questions about, well, why do people think the way they do? Why do they, what do they know, and what do they talk about, and how do they talk about these things that they know? I find that fascinating as well.
So to circle back, when you were talking about your first studying at university and you found that you resonated a lot with the context between the science, it sounded like you were talking about you felt those two were kept kind of separate, like there was the science classes and then there was the context and sociology behind it. Is that right?
Yeah, well, I mean, we tend to divide students into these two cultures to bring up old CP Snow and the two cultures kind of concept. We tend to divide students into either these HAS, you're an arts kid or a science kid. And I was both. And so, being forced to choose, I was like, no, I don't want to choose. I actually did a whole entire subject in year 12 that I needed to because I didn't want to give up ancient history and I had to do physics. And I would have probably dropped physics in a heartbeat, but I didn't even do biology. I did agriculture instead. So I did physics, chemistry, agriculture, and ancient history and advanced English, which just didn't seem, that was so unusual that it broke the timetable and I had to do something out of school. And then, so even in agriculture, most students came from a science background, even though economics was one of our first year units. So for me, they did tend to be divided. You were either one or the other. And I still see that reflected in our school system. And I find it disappointing. When I was at Adelaide, when I first started teaching the unit Science and Society, which I know some of the students are doing now, that was part of a Bachelor of Liberal Arts and Sciences degree. And I love that idea that you should be able to pick and choose and be both in this interdisciplinary space where they come together. But they didn't even advertise it. And so only 2 people did it and they killed the degree pretty quickly. And that sort of liberal arts education just doesn't happen in Australia. We tend to separate students and value the 2 streams very differently. And I think it's a real shame.
So when you finally did have to make a decision, at least, in determining what PhD question you would study, how did that feel to, at that time, be committing to sciences somewhat?
Oh, well, I probably had committed to a PhD when I was 16, to be honest, because I went, when I say my parents didn't go to high school, I had an uncle who did go to university, and he started out because he was the eldest in my father's family, so there was only ever going to be money for one person to go to uni, if that. In fact, there was no chance anyone could go to uni, but if it was going to be anyone, it would have been the eldest. And my uncle actually got a scholarship to go to university to do engineering, and that was funded by the Water Board, hated it, and then ended up going back to uni in the year that they went from a 4-year to a 5-year high school. So there was no high school leavers that year. So mature age students ruled that year. And so everyone got into uni, and that's when he went to do, I think, initially law, and then ended up doing arts, and ended up particularly in the history and philosophy of sciences. And he was a big influence in my life because he was an academic that I knew, and I thought, wow, that's just the coolest thing ever. And so he never actually did a PhD. He was, I think he started a PhD, but then ended up downgrading to a master's. So I'm the first PhD in my family. Yay me! But so knowing that academia was a pathway for me, even though we were poor, because of Gough Whitlam in the 70s, it meant that I knew that I could go to university if I was good enough, not if we were rich enough. And I was really grateful for that. So I wanted to go all the way. And so I wanted to do a PhD. I wanted to become an academic. I mean, archaeologists are academics anyway. And so for me, it was going to the National Youth Science Forum, or what was known as the National Science Summer School at the time. And this sort of brought together 300-odd students who were good in science from all around Australia, took them to Canberra. It was a 2-week intensive, showed us around all the places and said, Barry Jones, who was then Minister for Science, told us all we were the future of Australian science. And I took that to heart. I thought, wow, okay, I'm going to do that. And I think that's why I still have this sort of guilt that I didn't. That I didn't succeed in science. I'm like, I'm so sorry.
So you felt like that was a lot of pressure.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I'm still putting that kind of pressure on myself, but absolutely I thought it was a lot of pressure, because then I won like the young citizen of the Shoalhaven city, and I was going to be like great and have a Nobel Prize. And and of course life has these sort of twisty turny things and it doesn't end up happening. I mean, there isn't a Nobel Prize for agriculture, for starters. There is one for medicine or physiology. There's not one for biology. So you basically have to be doing biology applied to medicine or physiology in order to get something. So I realized I wasn't going to get a Nobel Prize being a pig scientist. But it was really the process of doing that degree, hanging out with some people. The projects were interesting. I ended up doing a project that was funded by the intensive livestock industry, which I realise is not necessarily an industry that everyone can relate to. And even the process of doing animal experimentation myself did become morally problematic for me. It was certainly not easy. Having death as an endpoint for my experimental animals. And I did start to question, whether that was the kind of thing that I wanted to keep doing. But I did feel very much that I wanted to contribute to Australia's scientific future. Absolutely.
So you mentioned being a pig scientist. So what was that was related to your PhD? What was that on exactly? What was the story of that?
So Bachelor of Science in Agriculture at the University of Sydney back then was a 4-year degree, and honours was awarded at graduation based on your WAM, your weighted average mark, but you did a project. And I was really interested in the dairy industry. When I was talking about physiology as weird, lactation. Lactation's weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
Ew, we exude body fluids that nurture our young. Ew. Anyway, lactation is kind of weird and kind of fascinating. So I thought I was going to end up in the dairy industry, but pig industry is offering more money. And the pig industry projects were much more interesting because they were there was a guy who was doing his PhD there and he was looking at heat stress. And if you learn nothing about pigs other than this, then I have done my job. Pigs don't sweat. So the vernacular idiom, sweat like a pig, is actually incorrect. So now you can go, but actually, so pigs don't sweat. They pant like a dog and wallow. That's how they cool down. And so when it gets really hot, pigs can get really hot and they don't grow very well and they can actually get very sick and die. So that's why they were doing a project looking at heat stress. But the way when we pant, we use up more oxygen. And so we have to expend energy in panting. And so what the project was really looking at was trying to work out energy metabolism during heat. And they said that when we finish this, like all good PhDs, there's a new one coming on that's going to apply the same kind of principles in disease. What kind of energy metabolism goes on during disease? So I did my honours on the heat stress stuff, but my PhD was to really look at what happens to energy metabolism in pigs that get sick. So the conventional wisdom was that when pigs get sick, because they move around less, that their energy metabolism will go down, so that there should be more, so the reason why they're growing slower is because they're actually, consuming less food and they're, reducing their energy metabolism. What I found after 3 years was no, it doesn't go down. It goes up. And so what I was able to do was work out that the reason why they don't grow is that not only are they eating less, but they are actually expending more energy fighting the disease. And we were using technology that's used in human intensive medicine. If you've ever had an accident and they put a pulse oximeter on your finger, where they measure the colour of the blood. So I had fibre optic cables in venous blood and in arterial blood, so I could work out the difference in oxygen that was being removed by taking the venous from the arterial. That's how much oxygen gets used by the body. And also I had blood flow probes around the heart, so I could work out the rate of delivery of that oxygen to tissues. And so we could see straight away that, when the pigs were sick, that they were using far more oxygen fight the disease, the rest of the disease process, and that's the reason for the growth reduction in pneumonia. So my whole PhD got reduced to one number in a newsletter sent to users of the particular computer software that we were doing the modelling for. But at least it got used by somebody.
Yeah, I imagine a lot of PhD students could probably relate to that.
Yes. It's like, wow. So instead of putting 0.1, you had to sort of put in 0.3 or something like that's what I did.
So did you go on to do any further research within the sciences after that, or did you leave? Yeah.
No, I went and did a postdoc in the Netherlands after that, where I was looking at pleuropneumonia in pigs, but this time we were putting the lungs in a box and letting them just sort of breathe in this box for a few hours while I was looking at early immune responses, looking at cytokine. But that was it was just having actually lungs in a box.
Interesting. So those kind of processes and skills you used, how does it compare the science communication research you now do to the science research you did? What's similar, what's different?
Wow, the ethics process, I guess, is very different. But it's such a head shift. And I feel like I've had this conversation already 3 or 4 times today. But in the sciences, the sciences, we're taught that the way that we find out stuff is that we're finding out about a universal truth, that there are things that are real and that are happening and they're true everywhere. And this is things like gravity, which we're finding is true everywhere in the universe. Photosynthesis, we haven't found any more examples of that, but photosynthesis is the same everywhere, and these sort of physiological mechanisms that I'm talking about, like respiration and things like that, the way the chemicals interact, the physical processes that make our bodies work, they are considered by science to be capital T truths. Mm-hmm. And that's why when we talk about science, the idea is that it should be the same no matter who does it and wherever it's done in the world or the universe. In the social sciences, we don't have that, and the humanities. When I am talking to people about whether they should eat genetically modified food or not, I don't take a position that there is an absolute right answer to that question. And that is, I think, where the tensions between the humanities and the social sciences and the sciences start. Because the sciences might say, well, no, there is a correct answer to that question. And the correct answer is, yes, I will eat it because we can prove that it's safe through experimentation. And we can also show that, there's all of these other reasons why it's safe to eat. But safety is not the only thing people consider when they eat food. They will also consider, it's affordability, accessibility, whether it's healthy, whether it's safe, whether it's going to poison you, whether it's nutritious, whether it actually does supply your body with the proteins and the energy and everything that you need. And then we start getting into, and is it produced in a way that doesn't destroy the planet? Is it produced in a way that aligns with my values? And they could be cultural values. They could be ethical, like cultural values, like some cultures traditionally don't eat anything. They could be religious values. We know that there's taboos around certain types of meat or for some meat, or shellfish. We know, or it could be an ethical choice, like somebody could be vegan. That also is it. And that sustainability might not just be, and that ethical might also be like whether it's involving slavery or groups of people. So we ask food to do a range of things that actually have nothing to do with science, and that your subjective truth, what's true for me may not be truth for you, is going to absolutely come into somebody's reason to eat a particular kind of food or not. But I had to go and spend time in a school of humanities to kind of learn that, or to really do research from that perspective. And I still see people in the sciences going, why don't people choose their food based on science? And I can use science to prove that this thing is safe and that thing is not safe. And my response to that is, well, there's no scientific reason for birthday cake, but I don't want to live in a world without it, right? So for me, food is not just scientific, it's cultural. It's how we connect to other people through our celebratory foods and through our rituals. It's how we express our identity. And this idea that something as fundamentally human as what food I eat is going to be a decision purely based on science is naive at best and incorrect at worst. But sometimes it's hard to tell scientists they're wrong, and particularly if you're coming from a humanities and social science perspective, because scientists are often taught that somehow that has less value than the mechanisms or the processes that they use to find out about the world.
Given that you started in the sciences, did you feel that you had some of those sort of values or perspectives of the social sciences trying to be indoctrinated in you?
Absolutely. So my education didn't stop with that postdoc. I did end up going back to uni again, did a graduate diploma in science communication. But I think that real research philosophy I wasn't exposed to until I started a master's, which I didn't finish, which is quite funny given that I can be one. Although I've been offered 2 Exit Awards instead, which is nice. But I was sitting in my approaches to research sort of unit, approaches to research in the social sciences. And I remember sort of sitting there almost with my arms folded, whole body language, like, no, thinking, this isn't very scientific. This doesn't sound like science at all. It sounds like people are making stuff up. And I did have that kind of like, oh, no, if you're taking this subjectivity, we can't generalize, and any of those sort of principles that we hold up in science as values of rigor, that objectivity, to have all of those absent initially did make me want to reject it. But then I learnt about the power of it and how you can use it for good and not for evil, and that the multiple subjectivities are more valuable because they build up that realistic picture than a single objectivity.
What caused the shift from science to science communication for you?
So there's a couple of ways for me to answer the question, but I think perhaps the best way is for me to be brutally honest. And that is that my contract ended in science because I was a postdoc who was in a position where I had to attract my own salary as well as my own grant funds. And that is a very precarious position for an early career researcher to be in, particularly in the location where I was not in a university, I was in a government research organisation. The idea that I could win a grant that would pay my own salary as well as give operating funds when I was still very early in my career, I think was unrealistic. Why did I accept that choice? The expectation of getting my own salary was probably more down to a set of personal circumstances where it seems like a better offer than where I was at the time. And it didn't pan out. And I then had to do a whole series of soul searching around, me getting that Nobel Prize in pig science looks even further away now. What am I going to do? And I'd always been interested in science communication. I'd become exposed to it at the National Youth Science Forum. I did naively go into it thinking, well, if people loved science or understood science the way I did, then other young women like me won't be in a situation where they feel that they need to accept this crappy 6-month job with no security. And that if I could make the world a better place for young scientists, then I would have done my job. So I did come into it with these naive expectations of making people love science so that scientists got a better deal. I don't believe that so much anymore. And it was much more of a realization that came much later. Like when I was working at the Science Centre, I was absolutely wanting to build science literacy. It was very much in that education space, wanting to support science education and wanting people to understand the social context and that science is done by real people with jobs and who need funding, etc. And then when I got the role as an education officer in a cooperative research centre around genetic modification, again, I was really wanting to help people understand the science so that they could make good decisions. But it was that process of of talking to people about the science and feeling like I couldn't answer their questions that were about the other stuff, like what about the role of agrochemical companies? What about who carries the risk? What about benefits? What about organic production? How do we do these things? And I was told I couldn't go there, that I started to think, well, hang on a sec, science isn't the only thing that's considered here. And I think that I returned back to that much more broader way of looking things, about seeing it all as connected, seeing it's not just one thing, that science happens in this social, economic, historical, political, cultural space, and it's that stuff that I'm actually more interested in than the science itself.
Awesome. So when you're explaining to people that you work in science communication, do you have a definition? Do you have an explanation you go to for that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's a conversation killer, really. You're at the pub having a chat with someone and like, so what do you do? And they're like, I do science communication. You just get nothing. Or like, oh, that's interesting. And then you just see them sort of go, oh, shivers, what am I going to do? Even my dad still doesn't quite get it. It's been so interesting because I say that I have been doing science communication since, for 20 or 30 years, but the type of science communication I've done is very, very different. For me, when I'm talking about, what I do or what I teach as a science communication, I usually say I'm helping people with mainly science backgrounds learn how to communicate with people without science backgrounds. Or I can, that might be one way I might frame it depending on the audience, because I still frame depending on the audience. I can't help myself. Or I might be saying, what I'm really interested in about how people talk about different scientific issues. That's probably more of a research angle. If I talk about what is science communication, it's people talking about science, and it can be scientists talking about their science to a bunch of other scientists, or it could be to people talking about, what kind of headache tablet to use. It could be really, quite basic. But I think, if we're talking about, what I teach and what I'm teaching in the context of teaching, it's really mainly people who are learning about science, how to talk about these issues with people outside of science. That tends to be the most visible type of science communication that people see, which is scientists or people with scientific expertise talking to people without that expertise. But that is a very limited view, and I've certainly done that type of science communication. How the sort of science communication that I'm more interested in now is far messier, will not have one set of expertise and one set of non-expertise. It's like everybody's an expert but in different stuff, and everybody thinks that their way is the best way, and everyone thinks that everyone else's way is not even real anyway. And so I'm much more interested in how that scientific discourse more generally, and how different ideas of what is knowledge and what knowledge counts, and how that comes to bear on these particular wicked problems like climate change, like the environment, like agriculture and food, like health and medicine. How do we have really constructive conversations, because we're all going to be coming from unique positions of knowledge. That's just how we are. So how do we have fruitful conversations where everyone's voice is included, and where we can come to some resolution around how to keep this amazing planet alive and how to live fruitful and healthy lives together.
So is that your big why, your motivator for science communication?
I think it's the big why for my life. So I guess that even comes first. Like, why am I here? What is my purpose? That I've then made science communication my thing. And yeah, absolutely. For me, I don't know why. But I am somebody, I'm not religious, but I do feel that I need to have a purposeful life, a useful life. Whether it was going to Scouts, like even in Brownies, how old are you in Brownies? 8. And the Brownie motto is to leave the world leave things in a better place than you find them. Or Cubs and Scouts, those sorts of rules was the moral code that I grew up with. You treat people with kindness, you leave things in a better state than you found them. And I do think that is something I've taken very seriously, whether it's perfectionism or just wanting to be useful. That idea of contributing to solving problems and making the world a better place is something that drives me. And I see science communication as a fundamental way of doing this. If we're really talking about in science communication, communication is how we make relationships. So studying or doing science communication, we are enacting this relationship between our major knowledge-making process that we have accepted on this planet and, the people for whom that affects. And so there needs to be a dialogue between the processes and the people that are making knowledge and the society that potentially impacts. And that's what science communication is to me. And so it is fundamental to answering the wicked problems that we have around, how do we balance our needs for energy with maintaining the environment and our need for food and the environment? And how do we ensure that we have equitable access to medicine, food, energy, and how do we live together as a society? And I think that's also why, coming back to the social thing, that's why, someone who's curious about history and philosophy, that comes into the social aspect as well as understanding the science. And for me, the two things just go together and show that how important it is that we have these really critical conversations about how we're going to share the planet now and into the future. And so it's absolutely why I get up in the morning. It's why I became a scientist. It's why I became a science communicator when that path felt closed to me. It's why I became a researcher, because I wanted to do that better. And it's absolutely why I'm a teacher now, because I can have more impact by enabling others to do what I now, in the twilight of my life, I will not be able to achieve. I mean, I still feel very young, but I feel like I'm running out of time. It's becoming more urgent. And so as a teacher, I can now have the most impact in terms of having the most useful life. Empowering others, seeing you all go off into the world and do amazing things is such a privilege.
On that lovely, hopeful note, Heather, I'd love to thank you for coming and sitting down and talking with us today.
You're most welcome.
And I hope that we can all do you proud as science communicators.
I think the important thing is not to do me proud, but to do yourself proud, and to also acknowledge that sometimes crappy things happen to amazing people. That doesn't mean you deserve them. Sometimes it will feel like the sun will never come out again, but it does. And it's important to just, find those things that light you up, find those people who support you and who are lit up by similar things, find your community, find your own terms for success, find your own why.
Thanks for listening. Find us online at thescicommcollective.com. That's com with 2 M's. Questions or comments about today's episode? Get in touch on Instagram.